Hello and welcome back to the Robin Zander Show. My guest today is Marie Szuts. You are incredibly talented at very, very many different things. And what's really particularly fun for me about Marie is I think most people who know her in one domain might not know her in another. So she is a world-class Viola Da Gamba player, and we'll dive into that in the interview. She is the multiple-time head of HR for really fast-growing technology companies. And came into the world of HR really with no experience doing HR and leading people functions. I can't wait to dive into this interview, and thank you for coming on today.
Excited to be here.
There's so many places that I'm excited to talk about because you're one of those people, and they're rare, that I encounter in my life who go deep in whatever it is that you're doing, personally or professionally. Like, the rabbit hole is endlessly deep. In your pursuit of whatever it is that you're pursuing, whether that's as a people leader, a musician, a mother, a magazine editor. And I want to talk about all of those things. But the thing that I wanted to start with is, are you still carving spoons?
Sure am.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not a hobby that I feel like you discard. Again, it's fun and useful, right? Those two things coming together.
I've never gone down the rabbit hole of carving spoons. So for me, and I've seen a tiny bit, right? Maybe I could even give a little context of, like, when I walk into your basement, right? I've been to your home a couple of times. And when I walk downstairs to your workshop, it's so clearly a craftsman's workshop, a craftsperson's place that they go to study and to play and to learn. What is it about spoon carving? What even is spoon carving? How did you get into that? And why is that not a hobby that you, or a practice, or a course of study that you don't give up easily?
So I think spoon carving has become more popular. I've seen this happening more than, before it was, I think, deeply, deeply niche. But there's something.
It's still deeply niche.
All right. Well, we're on a gradation here. But I think, for me, it was one of those things. And actually, this has kind of happened to me a few times in my life. I would say that, like, there's an idea that just sort of like gets lodged in my head. Wouldn't it be fun if, and spoons were a thing that, again, it's an object that everyone needs, everyone has, and so few people notice actually on a daily basis, right? Like, how often do you go and sort of like appreciate your spoon?
Very, very frequently.
Well, okay, fine. You're a special case. So again,
I have spoons in my house that I have stolen from airplanes that are specific for specific types of ice cream.
Goodness.
I have the spoons that are like the set of 4 spoons in my house that I like cherish and love, and after parties count to make sure I haven't lost any spoons because they're like so specifically exactly what I want to eat with.
So then again, you're a rara avis in this because, many people are they're thoughtless about their spoons. And, all jokes aside, I think this was something that kind of came to me as like, wouldn't this be fun if, and my sister and I actually did just a little workshop together. And this was sort of a nice way to kind of spend sisterly time. And I do remember sort of we were both doing it. And my sister, who's also a fantastic artist, she was sort of like, that was fun. And I'm like, oh, that was amazing. Like, I want to do this all the time. And so, if you talk about kind of the rabbit hole, I do tend to know about myself that finding these craft paths or something, right, is,
speaking of myself, at
right,
least.
But it's a deeply, deeply, again, you talk about flow state, right? Something where you can lock into being both deeply focused on what it is you're doing, but also your mind has that spaciousness because you're doing something perhaps slightly repetitive, but it's a very tangible pursuit. And so, the sort of the chisel, the sanding aspect, like all of it, has this physical transformation capacity. Literally you start with a block of wood, and it's roughed out in kind of this, sort of lollipop shape. And then, once you've worked at it, you actually come out with a spoon. And I find that when I sort of played around with different forms, I really got into this mode where it was like the wood sort of said what it wanted to be. I remember that I made this beautiful little walnut spoon, and it has this weird little like point at the tip. And so we joke that that's the creme brulee spoon because like literally it's like how, like baby, alligators have that little like snaggle tooth on the top so they can break out of the egg. That's literally what this looks like. And, and so it's not practical, but it is also as well. And so I think that kind of, there's something so fun about being in that space where you can both listen to the material and still, have an outcome that's not just something that's sort of just abstractly artistic. And so that craft for me, I really like the marriage of those things, the practical, but also the, everyday things can and should be beautiful.
That's a good title for this episode.
Right.
What's your experience of the word artistry or craft? Like, where in your life do you think of yourself, or how do you define yourself? How do you identify yourself as an artist or as a craftsperson in all of the things that you practice?
I actually think it just goes back to something we just talked about, in that everyday things can absolutely be artistic and beautiful. I don't think of artistry as something rarefied and something divorced from the quote unquote everyday. So I think of creativity as, again, it's like the air we breathe, and being creative and, making craft, making art is not something that is reserved as a sometimes thing. And I think a lot of that comes from just the way, music has been a huge part of my life, my entire life. And, I was lucky enough to have, various different teachers and also sort of some schooling that just normalized the idea that, music it's just part of your daily routine. And so again, that sense of like, it absolutely can be transcendent and is often, but like why we cannot just reserve the possibility of transcendence for moments where we think it should occur.
Meditating on a hill.
Right. Or Sundays or what have you, right?
Let's go back to your upbringing and as it relates to music, because I know music has been a through line. So yeah, what is the earliest? What are some of the earliest memories you have of music?
Yeah. I have a household and parents who, in particularly my father, who, he's a musician through and through. He played piano his entire life. And at the age of 30, he took up the cello because he had always loved it and, sort of worked at it. And again, taking up a string instrument at that point in your life, it is a very different physical set of sensations, and in your mind's eye what you want it to sound like. And it's hard.
Speaking as somebody who spent a couple of months here and there in my 30s working on the cello, it doesn't sound like what I want it to sound like.
Right. And, in that vast gap, and you sort of, wow, this is a long road. But they're both that sort of innate musicality, again, that I think my dad had. And, I just used some of my earliest memories, literally being under the piano. We had a grand piano in our house, and there were some cushions underneath it, crawling under the piano, where it's, by the way, very loud, and even when someone's playing soft. But just that's a full body musical experience. You feel the music that's happening. And there's this one lovely piece by Bach called Arioso that is, it's a lovely cello. You can play it on cello too, but my dad would play that on piano. And so I just have that. Again, it feels like it's in my bones. And so I took up the koto at age 4 because my mother. So the koto is a Japanese instrument. It's often referred to as if this is going to help English speakers understand, but it's a 13-stringed zither. You're like, oh, cool, zither. Yeah, that's really well known. But it's a kind of rectangular box, and it's played on the ground with a slight raise of the top. There's a little sort of bridge that holds it up, and it has 13 strings that do have these movable bridges that, literally they tune the instrument, right? It's the same physics that, happens with string instruments. And you play it with little picks that they're little like leather circles, and it's got a bone, sort of like almost like nail, and you put them on, and you can play all sorts of stuff. And, the music is in Japanese. And so my mother is an anthropologist of Japanese culture. And so she plays the shamisen, which is a 3-stringed, almost sort of banjo type string instrument, and also the koto. And so this was something that I did, and I had a teacher and all sorts of stuff. That really is my first instrument. And, I remember playing with her, right? Koto duets. And so I think that is a salient point, because for me, so much of what my musical life has been is this idea, this is a language that you are sharing with somebody else. And the sense of chamber music in all its forms, in all its cultures, is so deeply a human way to communicate.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm telling you, like as a 5-year-old taking up the cello and I had to practice, it's not like I had these philosophical thoughts of like, oh, you know what I'm doing now? I was like, no, I don't want to practice. But genuinely, there's clearly a something that connects. And not only the sense of accomplishment as you do practice and you get more towards that ideal of what the sound is that you want to have. But so at age 5, I took up the cello, and sort of since, from then on, that was my instrument. And I'm the oldest of 3 children. And so my siblings also took up instruments, and my brother's actually a professional musician, now. And so
I would argue that you are also a professional musician now.
Fair.
Even if that is not the primary drive in your professional life or what you're most known for among your peers.
Yes, no, that's fair. I mean, and I think that there's an element to also, again, the joy of teaching and connecting with others. And, so my musical journey, while starting in cello, now it's in a different stringed instrument zone, which we can talk about as well. But all my memories are also of playing with each other. And my dad, my brother, and I, we used to play trios. I mean, we used to joke that it was sort of like also our way of getting out of doing the dishes. Sorry, Mom, can't do the dishes, have to play some Mendelssohn, right? Like, who's going to argue with that? But all jokes aside, that was really, it was something we deeply enjoyed being able to do together, and I think was a huge foundation.
Beautiful. I don't have the foundation in music and study in music and family that you do, but, I was regimented piano for many years and a handful of years as a kid, and then discovered mallet percussion. And while I don't day-to-day practice percussion or drums anymore, it feels like it's in my bones in the way that you described. So much of who I am as a movement artist, as a dancer, as an acrobat is tied into that early exposure of percussion. Totally.
And that rhythm, it's there.
Yeah. It's not something I think about. It's not something I even think to be grateful for very often, but it is foundational.
Yeah.
I want to keep going on your course of study as a musician, but first I want to pay you a compliment, which is we met very shortly after I moved to San Francisco, very shortly after I finished undergrad. You were one of the first handful of people, 2, 3, 4 people that I met when I first moved to San Francisco in 2007-ish. And I don't remember the exact context by which, like, my sister-in-law, with whom you went to school, introduced us, but I remember being really struck by the diversity of skills at which you are, at least in my limited experience of those domains, a master, or have spent a lifetime your lifetime to date studying those things. So music being one, we'll get into it, the modern face of HR and people leadership being another. But it was striking to me at the, impressionable age of whatever I was, 20, to see here as somebody who is more than a decade my senior, who has the ability to be really, really, really good, like world-class good, at multiple different things, whether or not they're chosen for the professionalism of like, this is what I'm going to do to earn money. And that really left a mark for me, because up until late college, right, moving to San Francisco, et cetera, I always had to hide, right? And even after that, but hide, I am a professional acrobat performing backflips with the San Francisco Opera while working a day job for an education company, and neither one could know about the other, because it is not acceptable to be good at both of these things, or to try to balance a life that that includes spoon carving and music and people leadership and more. So thank you.
Yes. I mean, again, it feels like such a shame that people experience needing to keep such things separate, because as you experience, like, those are parts of who you are in a way that I really think inform one another in the most positive sense.
I could not possibly be CEO of Xander Media if I was not also practicing as a movement person, as an acrobat most days. Like, I can't not do both. I would not be able to do either without the other. Where did that come from for you, or the courage to go deep down courses of study that, are not the single thing that you're going to do for the next 20 years? Do you know?
I have a few hypotheses. I think that again, it goes back a bit to family and the kind of intellectual environment that I guess it's an intellectual and emotional environment in which I was raised, in the sense that I did not have an overwhelming set of pressure from parental figures that were like, narrow your scope, like be a doctor, be a whatever, I will say, I think the one thing that they were kind of like, just please, maybe don't be a professor. Like, and that came actually really from their experience. They were both professors at University of Chicago, extremely successful ones, but found that academia was not for them for various different reasons.
Yeah.
It was not, and it wasn't the like actual sort of, again, course of specific study that they didn't like. It was really the politics about being all this kind of stuff. And so, and I think even if I had come to them and like, you know what, the only thing that's going to make me happy is being a professor of like Italian medieval literature, they would have been like, okay, right, and they would of course have supported that. But genuinely, I did not get. Really, sort of the only directive I ever had from them was like be interesting, do things, and I think for both of them as well, just the modeling, even if they didn't explicitly say this, neither of my parents half-ass anything. Like when they take something up, they take it up. There was a spate of my childhood when my mother got really interested in flamenco dancing. So we had a flamenco dancing floor and like in the house. And it wasn't because she had aspirations to become a professional flamenco dancer. So there's, I think that the concept of amateur is one that is wrongly maligned it's almost used as a derogatory term,
totally.
Right? But literally, right, because I can't ever talk to anybody without going to Latin etymology, but like amateur comes from Latin, like amator, right, to love, right? It's sort of something that, comes from a love of doing something, not because you're necessarily prescribing it into gainful employment or like, what's the ROI? What's the ROI on my spoons? And again, I think that that's something, and I absolutely have fallen into that trap too, but it's the question of like, your side hustle, and then you turn that into your real hustle. And it sucks all the joy out of it, right? And it means that it's no longer, it can. It's possible not to, but you have to be deft about navigating that. And so, to answer your question, I think that I saw that as a successful MO of life. I saw, an unconventional career path in my parents. And my father was a professor of medieval and Chinese history, and then left that and became a consultant at McKinsey. Like, right? And so that then didn't seem weird to me to have pathways that were not straight linear, not like a ladder, not kind of you're 7 steps before you're thinking about getting schooling in the thing that you want to go for. So I attribute a lot of it to that. And then also, I think you just try it, you do it, and it turns out it actually sort of enriches your life. So guess what? Positive reinforcement, you keep doing that. And I think that the communities I have met and cultivated through these different paths, I so deeply feel that they've enriched my life and continue to enrich my life that I find it impossible to imagine sort of hemming myself in just to whatever it is, right? And and I'm again, I think aware that when I behave that way too, it is also sending it's sending a modeling lesson to my children about sort of the enriched life, the one where, again, you can be a dilettante in certain senses because it's adding to, you don't have to be excellent at everything, right? But trying stuff is a really, it's a huge part of being alive.
Beautiful. I was frequently called rigorous by an ex of mine. And when you describe your parents, and I think about mine in that same breath, the willingness, the dedication to like go all in on something. My parents also do not half-ass anything that they do. And I'm going to pass that compliment on to them because I can attribute some of my going broad deeply as well to some of those aspects of my upbringing.
Yep.
So Viola da Gamba.
Yes.
What is it? Talk to me about your journey too, and your current relationship with the Viola da Gamba.
I love it. So the Viola da Gamba, it's an instrument, predates modern violins, violas, cello. It's an instrument family, I should say. And it's not a direct ancestor. Sometimes that's sort of a shorthand that people, it's like the grandfather to the cello. Nuanced. There's literally this family of instruments that you can think of in some ways as a bowed guitar. They have 6 strings, like guitars do, but they have a curved bridge. If you think about a guitar bridge is flat, so you can strum. A viola da gamba has a curved bridge, so you can actually play it with a bow. And this was an instrument that really, it came out of probably a combination of a Moorish instrument called a rabob, which was a 3-stringed bowed instrument held upright, and a guitar, a Spanish vihuela, sort of, union of these two things in this kind of fertile period, 13th, 14th, 15th century, like what's happening. And the instrument family, there's small ones, medium-sized ones, and big ones. They're really just absolutely meant to be played with each other. They were a chamber music instrument. And the sort of sound that you get out of them is one that is in some ways familiar to a modern ear, but in other ways not, because it just, if you're more used to, say, the big orchestral, like string sound, lots of vibrato, very, very rich, hugely powerful instruments that can be in a concert hall. The Viola da Gamba was, it was, a chamber music instrument for chambers. Literally, like that's what chamber music comes from, right? Like music in a room, like en chambre, right?
Yeah.
And this was, was a very, very popular instrument in the upper classes. I mean, again, let's be honest, right? If you're somebody who is working in a subsistence way, you're probably not going to have a lot of time to do something like this. But if we go back also to this idea of being an amateur or being, a dilettante, which pejorative, like take away the pejorative connotation of this with somebody, it comes from the word delight, that this is how you would have humanist conversation with your other, burgher or aristocratic friends. They became patrons of composers. And so there's just massive amounts of fantastic chamber music written for this type of gathering and this type of instrument. And it's sort of a kind of transcendent way to gain access to the power of chamber music, even if perhaps you haven't hit a very high technical level. So there's just this real range of repertoire that this instrument has. And so I, again, being a lifelong cellist, it was one of those moments where wouldn't it be a lark if, wouldn't it be fun? Same with the spoons. That I was a sophomore in college. And I got it in my head that it would be fun to maybe mess around a bit, and try. And I had known about the Viola da Gamba. I had to take music history. I mean, this was an instrument that, super popular, 16th, 17th, then falls deeply out of favor as being old-fashioned. In come the violins, and cellos. They're louder. They're, again, the music being written is different. And gamba is it's hopelessly old-fashioned, right? And there was, sort of a few things written, but it was actually, anytime it was written for, it was like a knowing nod of this is an old-fashioned thing that I'm musically making a point to do, right? And then there experiences a revival in the 20th century. Some people, they find old instruments, many of which had been converted into cellos. And they, sort of dig it up and they find this music and manuscripts. And so there's, and this was really in England and in the US, sort of interest was going up. And so actually in 1962, a group of people kind of banded together and started what was to become the Viola da Gamba Society of America. Again, small, but, enthusiasts around this. And, what did they want to do? They wanted to play music together. But it was scholarship was happening by people doing it too, because you're sort of getting access to this stuff that hasn't, has literally been just intellectualized, right, for the past several hundred years. And very quickly it became so obvious that, again, the intoxication of this instrument was to be able to play it with each other. And so that powered the Viola da Gamba Society of America for being, it's now since 1962 has been a continuously operating nonprofit to support the playing and the scholarship and the concertizing on this instrument. So I'm a sophomore. I'm at school, and my school had a collection of musical instruments, again, old instruments. And so I walked over there. This is one of these collections that's open, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 1:15. It's not, so I walk over there and I'm saying, well, you have a Viola da Gamba here. do you know any teachers? Which in retrospect is sort of a hilariously naive question. And he said, actually, there's a music school around the corner and we think that there's someone there. Why don't you go check it out? Turns out, neighborhood music school. This is in New Haven. It's been around since 1911. One of the preeminent pedagogues of the Viola da Gamba happens to teach there. She's taught there for like 60 years. She's incredible. And so I walk over there again, sort of blithely, expecting I'm just gonna sort of screw around with this. But one of those teachers that you walk in and you get an instrument and you look at that person and you're just like, oh, you are an educator. I will not disappoint you. Right? There's like something that locks in, and I had it in my hands. And again, being a cellist, I had some access to the idea of you put a bow on a string and like you have to do some adjustments to make a sound. But the technique really is, substantively different enough. But again, so we're speaking with this teacher who's like, I don't care how good of a cellist you are. You will start at the beginning here to really learn. And so again, there's that sort of magical moment, not only of the instrument itself, which I loved, but being in the presence of somebody who teaches that way.
Yeah.
You're just like, well, I don't care what you're going to teach me. I'm going to learn things from you.
Yeah.
And so she is absolutely one of my greatest mentors in my life. And that, thus began the love affair with the gamba. I mean, my college roommate, she still laughs because, I would sort of come home and I was like, I don't want to do my homework. I just want to practice gamba. And it was just, again, this what a fun thing to do when you're highly capable at many other things. And then here's the thing you want to do and you actually are really reveling in being a beginner. That is such a delicious experience. So I took that up and again, fell headlong into this world. Went to the Viola da Gamba Society's week-long workshop that they do every summer. It's colloquially known as Gamba Camp, which again, there's not that many gamba players in the world. So you're there and you're like with several hundred of them.
For context, like how many gamba players do you think that there are in the world?
Well, okay. The VDGSA has 1,100 members and there's other societies too. So, we're talking, there's tens of thousands in the world.
Yep. Yeah. By contrast, how many people play the cello or play the guitar?
Many millions. Right. It is different.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
And again, there's people who sort of will cross over, but the way in which that community also welcomes new players. I mean, talk about like, again, sort of chosen community, chosen family type of experience. Like, I mean, tribal, but not in like a non-inclusive way.
Yep.
Right. And I think about this too, in terms of like where, just in general, right? Like people and their communities and what they're connected to or not nowadays. And, there's a lot of ink spilled about the idea of, people not going to church or not having civic groups that they're connected with. And this sort of real...
It's my movement communities for me. It is the crew that I do acrobatics with regularly and have for years, right? It's the musicians.
That's right. And it's a wide spread of demographics and also age and experience and profession. But you come together through this shared love.
What have you learned as a musician that you then have carried forward into building the organizations as a people leader over the last decade that you've been a part of?
Oh, I mean, God, like all chamber music, it's being a consummate team member and leader. That is, I mean, it is directly correlated, right? Because when you are negotiating how to play a piece, both wordlessly and, in a break in a rehearsal where you're writing stuff in, that has all the elements of, the diplomacy, the communication skills, the distilling, like what is actually happening, right? So acute listening, active listening, literally on like what is, again, what's said, what is not said, collective decision-making, disagree and commit. I mean, it's literally all there, right? And so the very direct experience, I think, has absolutely informed how I approach again, being a team player, and I include being a manager or a leader in that. I mean, being a leader doesn't mean you're not a team player. It just means you have a role within that group. But it doesn't mean a command and control. You can do that, but I'd wager it's less successful than, a piece of music where really people are deeply inspired and feel safe enough also to try interesting things.
I really like this metaphor. So often, teams of in a professional context, right? The metaphors are military or sports teams, or for me, like dance troupe. But this idea, and I got to see you in concert just a couple of days ago. What is it? One of six on stage. There's no way one person of six can command and control. But right, watching your face with your colleagues in this concert, the playfulness, the invitation, like you are so clearly in conversation with the people on the stage and with us in the audience.
Totally.
In a way that I think is a really, really useful, fun metaphor for business.
Yes.
Before we go into what is the modern face of HR, what about the Yale Divinity School? Will you talk a little bit about your continuing education in study of divinity?
For sure. So I have a master's degree from the Yale Divinity School, and it's a Master of Arts in Religion. So it's not a sort of quote unquote religious degree. Many of my colleagues and fellow students, were getting their MDivs, and many would go on to do ordination. But I really, it was an extension of the studies I had done as an undergraduate, which were in medieval history, and the reason I pursued that and loved that was not, again, thank you to my parents. It was not because I felt, academia is the life for me, but rather I found that studying that, sort of time frame, that part of the world, I was able to do it in such a multidisciplinary way, because that's how humans work. Period. Like in a multidisciplinary way. You can't just be like, I study history. No. You also study art and astronomy and architecture and math and science and, political science, all of these things, and law, they all fit in a way that helps, again, humans make sense of the world around them. And again, like a lot of those are not necessarily like stories that are particularly healthy, I guess, in a way, and there's, of course, much, I don't romanticize the medieval period, or the Renaissance period as, just being about all like gold brocade and like, the Sistine Chapel, like
sure,
deeply, deeply challenging in many ways. And I, as an undergraduate, just again fell down the rabbit hole of learning Latin and becoming very, very curious about the writing of saints' lives as a literary form. It's called hagiography, right? And it's literally sort of when you're telling the life of a saint, clearly there's an agenda that the author has, but there's also so many delicious, interesting details about what happens, and you sort of like, well, why, right, and how? And so, 4 years as an undergrad is not enough time to learn all that. So I went back to graduate school, again, it was really as, I'd been working in New York for almost 6 years as a magazine editor. And I was like, kind of like, well, this is an intellectual treat for myself. I went back to Yale too. So I also felt like I knew the campus and I wasn't going to spend a lot of time there. And it was just a 2-year degree. And I was part of what's called the Institute of Sacred Music, which is a kind of small graduate center with 1 foot in the Div school and 1 foot in the music school. And so it's, but your degree is granted by, it has to be one or the other. In the music school, it's like organ performance or choral conducting.
Okay.
So, but I hung out with the music kids. But again, like sort of doing the divinity degree, it was just talk about a fascinating anthropological experience, because my classmates were, many of them, going on to ordination, and I'm this kid from Berkeley who is like, that's who that guy is in the Bible, like, and just sort of, and not at all in a way that's like, snarky or disrespectful, but just very much this sort of, again, fertile intellectual environment, as well as, for people who are, deeply, faith-based, a place that they could also grapple with these different things. So that's, it was deep. It was really fun.
Great. Thank you. So let's flash forward, magazine editor, and then into the HR roles that you've held, and the work that we've come back full circle into contact with. So what was your transition into editing magazines, and in a completely different domain than any we've talked about so far in food?
So I, again, Italian medieval history, graduate from college, let's move to New York and get jobs, right? Yeah, like that's sort of, again, hilariously naive kind of, but that's a huge part. I was privileged enough to have that naivete and not, sort of be freaking out that I needed to sort of immediately go and like pay off student loans or anything like that. Again, so I'm very, very lucky to have had this sort of like, let me continue my work on culture, but do it in a way that now, sort of is I'm no longer a student. And so I literally, I wrote a letter, like a physical letter. That's how old I am. To an Italian cooking magazine based out of New York. And I said, I've been studying, Italian culture. I speak Italian. I will do anything for you. Like, do you have anything that I could do? And they wrote back several weeks later saying, actually, we have a position of web editor open. Why don't you come in and interview for it? I mean, and I truly, even though, of course, I had spent the past 4 years like writing papers, I sort of had to base kind of my experience on, having been the co-editor of like some ridiculous like humor, newsletter of my college that I had done kind of, again, as on a whim with my roommate. And so I went in for an interview and ended up getting hired as the web editor of this website. It's called ItalianCookingAndLiving.com, sort of a mouthful of a URL. And I mean, talk about, it was like my dream job. Like assignments I had were like, go research the etymology of like, the herb tarragon and like write a little paragraph about it. Like, hell yes, I'll do that. And I found it just to be absolutely a continuation of this idea of culture and connection, right? I mean, food is a central part of community and culture all over, but like especially in Italy. I mean, this is, being like a tavola, right? Like at the table with others is an enormously important part. I mean, and again, there is no such thing as Italian food. It's all regional, right? And this is,
of course,
right, connected to the history of the place, the terroir of the place, all these different things. And so it felt entirely like it was both using skills I had already been developing and then allowing me to kind of, move into developing additional competencies. Because sort of long and the short of it, I was put in charge of the print magazine relatively quickly through some vagaries of like how the company actually worked, and ended up being the managing editor of these print magazines, which had a really large circulation. And again, I had no business doing that per se, other than, well, I'll just figure it out, right? Kind of one foot in front of the other, making mistakes all over the place, but incorporating what I learned. I was made a manager very early too, people vastly senior to me with vastly more domain expertise of different types. And so, again, I didn't learn management from a book. I learned it by like doing it, screwing it up, doing it again, getting a little bit better, learning sometimes by negative example. And so, again, a hugely formative time. And frankly, that's the coolest cocktail party job ever. What do you do? I work for a cooking magazine. What? Right. I mean, I was actually just thinking about this the other day. I absolutely still have cooking implements that, I got as freebies. I think my potato masher straight up from those days, and like, so again, that kind of environment taught me a huge amount and is totally the underpinning of how I think about people in community.
You transitioned from that magazine to Chili Pepper magazine. Yes. And one of the things that I love about spending time with you is you will randomly have stories. For example, that time that I was the professional taste tester for a chili cook-off. I don't know if you know the specific story that I have in mind, but if you wanted to share that, I would love to hear it again.
I think you may be referring to the International Chili Society's cook-off that they did annually, and it was in the parking lot of a hotel in Las Vegas because there was all these cook stoves, so it had to be outside. And yes, I was a
What was
taste
your
tester.
Role at the magazine?
I was the editor-in-chief of this magazine about zesty food. It was global, and I mean, again, anthropologically, boy, is that interesting because you can be global. You really, aren't just sort of like repeatedly, doing chili with an I recipes. You're thinking about the way people have used spice, across the world. And I found that, again, like the Italian magazine, people are so incredibly passionate about these things. And like how privileged that is to be able to talk to people about things they're passionate about. Like, it's just, again, you learn things just spill out of them. It's kind of this, infectious joy that people have. And so, yes, I did get to be one of the finalists to judges. But, again, this is where it sort of like starts to break down that like it sounds cool in theory, But, when you're taste testing like 25 different chilies and like what you have to do to palate cleanse in between each bite is like take a bite of sour cream, you pretty much feel like death at the end of that day. But still, like, you do it for the art. It's fine.
Your work, most I think of, let's say our shared professional overlap knows you as, a senior head of HR, as a senior people leader at fast growing companies. Most recently, you've been at Figma. Before that, you were at Inkling, both technology companies on just this expedited rate of growth and trajectory. What was, and people vie their whole careers to try to land a senior people leader job at a prestigious company. From the outside, it looks like you kind of fell into that, just like you did into medieval studies or magazine editor. What was your introduction first to Inkling? And then I'm interested in lessons learned very selfishly for me at Xandr Media and for folks listening at organizations of like, what does it mean to successfully lead an organization as the person most directly responsible for thinking about the well-being of their employees? But let's start with landing at Inkling and growing into the role of people leader.
I mean, really, again, my editorial experience was the key in there. And I find that I draw, and I will be an editor for the rest of my life, right? Again, there's this kind of aspect of thinking about content and thinking about storytelling that I think is the through line. And that was the sort of opening kind of question for me. So I began at Inkling, which was back in 2010. It was at that point a textbook company, a digital textbook. How are we going to reinvent the textbook so it's not just a PDF on a screen, but it's something dynamic? iPad had just come out. So Apple's doing hardware. Like, what about the software? And so when I began there, I was one of the original content architects. Right? The idea of this role that sat between, at that point in time, textbook publishers and then engineers, within the company. And how do you, if we're going to seek to make it not just a sort of flat carbon copy of the print version, but really transform it into something more interesting, you got to have somebody who actually can sort of serve as that translator. So that was the metaphor I came up with, is, being a translator, you speak both the original language and the target language. And that it's not, you can't just translate like a proverb word for word because it's basically nonsensical, right? So same thing, you can't grab an unordered list in a textbook that has pedagogical intent and just sort of port it over without thinking about the idea that like, well, what if you turn the iPad to landscape mode? This idea of sort of, design it once and future-proof it,
yep.
It was just sort of starting to be a thing. And again, what fun to be on that forefront of like testing things and trying stuff, but still caring a great deal about accuracy. In the early days. And so I ended up, running the content development side of Inkling. And I found that, our mission was, not only is the student going to have like an elevated experience, but also the editors, the people, those were my people, like the editors of the textbooks who were subject matter experts and had frankly always been disenfranchised from anything digital because it was a different team. It's like, oh, you finish this textbook and then you hand it over to the digital team. And then pretty much they were like, I don't even want to see it ever again because I know it's going to be riddled with errors because no one is going to have taken the care on that unordered list and it's going to be screwed up in some, the indents are going to be. And what a shame to lose not only like that accuracy, but that all of that expertise of those people. And so I loved what we were seeking to do was not only, again, like have us be the intermediaries, but ultimately what we did was we built a tool that let people create digital content in a way that, was much more sort of WYSIWYG, right? What you see is what you get. You didn't have to know HTML in order to make something look right. And so it was delightfully mission driven for me in that sense, because it felt like, again, not only are we creating something like really like with high craft, but there's an element of like teaching other people to access something they were otherwise unable to do. And so, being a kind of content person, about halfway through my tenure there, that was the business shift we made, right? No longer selling textbooks directly to just individuals, but rather what could we do to businesses to enable them to unlock this idea of digital content? But that's a pretty big business shift. That caused some business pivot, some, question of staffing, and I had a very large team on the content side that, we repurposed as many people as we really could. And for some, it was sort of not the right leap. And that's a very painful thing to go through. So we had a reduction in force. And
How big was the company at the time?
it was 150 or so.
And how many people on your team?
There were like 20 or 25. So it was a substantive team. I think we were the second largest team behind just engineering. And it was, again, like remarkably challenging for everybody because it had felt, we were just on this mission together and and then it was just like this wound. And we didn't have a people team. We had very, very thoughtful, it's sort of I've reflected in the past, well, how did we manage to last so long without it was because I think, leadership on the part of the CEO who cared very deeply about these different things, and just in general, managers had, they took this on. But I had found myself as a leader of the content side. We had a chief of staff who I was always sort of just curious, hey, can I help? This, and it was just of interest. And so, when the time came to kind of rebuild, there was a question of can we build a people team? And so that's where I was lucky enough, again, to have the trust of the org, of the leader, the CEO to say, this is not going to be easy because I know no access to any of the sort of nitty gritty HR learnings. And so again, I didn't downplay how important that was. You're not kind of oh yeah, easy, learn from the book. No, we knew it would be hard, but we thought that would be learnable. What I did have was, I think, a fair amount of credibility within the org as a manager who cared a lot.
Yep.
And again, there's sort of a common sense element to, what is it that we want to build together, and can we build that trust with the employee? Which again, after a riff, boy, trust is something that is challenging to rebuild.
Yeah.
So that was, a very that was a gift for me to be able to try that. And so I spent the first, 18 months really, feeling dumb, I would say, in some ways, right? Because when you try something, you go from being an expert at something to being a real beginner, and the stakes are really high.
And in that case, unlike perhaps, spoon carving, right? Not to downplay spoon carving, but the consequences are people's livelihoods and the success of the organization.
Exactly. So that's, again, when the stakes are high, it's a different sort of access to that joy of being a beginner.
Yeah. And to circle back around, we had been in touch when I first moved to San Francisco, had lost contact along the way, and it was probably 7 years, something in that range. And then I think it was some of your direct reports at Inkling attended Responsive Conference, my old conference in 2017 or 2018. And somehow the connection was made. I don't know if you reached out to me or one of their people made the intro, and it was, wait, is that Marie? And you were like, wait, is that Robin, who I used to know, who was my sister-in-law, your college friends, my sister-in-law. And then realizing that both of us a decade later had ended up in this HR ecosystem and HR space.
Totally.
Yeah.
And again, sort of seeing that and reconnecting, around those things and being yes, yes.
Very few things matter more. So after Inkling, you moved on to Figma, which is a well-known rocket ship of a design organization, design technology company. I'm less interested in the specifics of each organization that you've been a part of as a people leader, and more, give me advice. I'm a young CEO of a growing agency. There are so many people out there struggling. And I mean, especially in the year 2022, we're seeing so many, not just the layoffs recently, but people dissatisfied at work. What did you do that was successful at Inkling? What did you do at Figma? What have you seen people doing well, whether that's a CEO or a chief people officer, to build organizations that really balance? Because sometimes the needs of a people are, someone needs a salary raise and the organization literally doesn't have the money to enable that. They're not always aligned. And you are responsible, as am I, for balancing the tension between what is best for the organization, which only I really can know, and what is best for the people, which I can get to know as well as I can get to know my people. So how do you live at that tension in the middle while trying your best to serve the people in the organization that you're a part of?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's annoyingly, the answer is it depends, right? That there is no secret sauce, there is no magic bullet, whatever, right? There is no sort of one playbook that is going to guarantee your success in navigating these dynamic challenges and opportunities. But I would say, if you had to kind of boil it down into things that are highly likely going to contribute to success, number one would absolutely be this idea of building trust far and wide. And, you know, that is not just the big grand gesture. This is the like, I mean, I keep saying this, but like trust is gained in teaspoons and it's lost in buckets, right? And, you know, it's like you got to commit to the damn teaspoon. And it's like countless micro interactions. You know, your behavior, like what you do, speak so loudly, I cannot hear what you say. But like this concept of trust building, and that encompasses this idea of relationships with people as real humans. And again, I don't mean like over rotate on the idea that like it's all that and like nothing about business strategy. Absolutely don't mean that. But if, you know, you think about trust as the bedrock of an organization and the ability to, when you have like one of those tension moments, between sort of, you know, again, someone needs a raise and this kind of, you know, what's the economic conditions that you are able to use that, or that trust is the thing that makes it possible to have that dialogue and have it be one that has an outcome where, again, even if it's not sort of like I get the exact raise that I'm expecting, like I feel connected to this organization and in partnership, you know, with it. And I think that the sort of other questions about leadership are ones that I think, you know, supplementing your own competencies ASAP. Do not be afraid to say that there are things that you are not
I
great
suck at, and can I hire or resource those things outside of myself?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
right? You know, and this, I mean, that is key for not only you, but every person in the organization, because you're scaling the company by every necessity. It's going to be different. You are not going to do the same thing multiple times, most likely. You know, the organization, like every time, I used to sort of joke, you know, every time you run a performance review cycle, it's literally like you know, you can use like maybe 10% of what you did before because the organization's bigger. And so you're constantly navigating this change management idea. And so like how you do it, you know, you do not need to do it in a vacuum. And in fact, the people who do it in a vacuum are completely miserable, you know, and less successful. So I'd say, sorry, number one, right, build trust far and wide. Number two, this idea of supplementing your own competencies. I think this concept of like, you know, knowing, like communication matters beyond anything. And I think my editorial experience really has taught me that, you know, so much about storytelling that needs to be a necessary skill for leaders. And again, I don't mean storytelling in the sense of like you're feeding people a line, but like literally, what is the story that you're telling so they can...
What's the narrative arc? What's the through line?
Exactly.
Why are we here?
Right. Get on board with that. And, you know, that's also the only way that you're going to be able to sort of like get the resources you need to carry on and continue to build. And so again, that's at all levels of the org, but especially like something coherent, you know, so it's like you all... Like there's a why. There's nothing that will piss employees off more than being handed decisions and they don't understand why it's happening. And, you know, I mean, it makes them cynical. It makes them do a crap job. Like, it's just like, that is one of the biggest death knells you can do is like, you know, give decontextualized, you know, just directives and then change your mind like willy-nilly. Ooh, 2 thumbs down. And then I think sort of lastly, I would say this concept of sort of like time travel in a way. And what I mean by that is don't just focus on today. You actually also have to keep an eye on the tomorrow that you want. And you have to articulate what time horizon you're talking about. Some of the biggest sort of like mismatch, you know, like, I thought you wanted this, comes from people just actually talking about things on different time horizons, but they didn't surface that that's what's happening.
Yeah.
And I know you can't see the future, right? Like, it's ludicrous for startups to be like, you know, like, I know exactly what's going to happen 9 months from now. I get that. But directionally, like, if you aren't talking about that, the decisions you make today will either be disjuncted or like, you know, quite possibly, you know, sort of problematically, you know, anti what you want to do. You know, and that plays out in lots of different ways. You know, what are you thinking of? Like, how are you hiring? How are you thinking about, you know, resourcing and all this kind of stuff? And again, you don't want to sandbag, but you also want to ensure, to your point, that you have the business strategy top of mind, you know, and that is, it's not just your responsibility. Everyone else also has to know about it so they can make better decisions too. Leading is hard.
Yeah. There's so many places I want to go. We've already been at this for more than an hour. You are headed into a sabbatical and sort of a period of reflection and figuring out what's next. But for folks who are watching or listening to this, where can they go to learn more or to keep track of you or to sort of figure out, along your journey, where to from here?
I mean, I love to connect with people. Again, the reason I'm in this business, I found this career as actually, I think, a sort of excellent combination of the competencies and the skills and the things I love to do. I mean, it feels like sort of like, wow, this all happens to like fit under this umbrella. Like, sweet, right? I mean, connect with me, right? There's the LinkedIn. There's not very many Marie Szuts out there, so you're going to be able to find me. I am loving this sort of phase of contemplation, of learning, of exercising different types of skills, different types of interactions with people, coaching, consulting, advising. They're all very, very different. But sometimes people like combine them all at once, and I'm loving teasing them out and getting to do that.
Well, Marie, this is such a pleasure. I've been wanting to do this for a long time, for even myself to hear some of the nuances of your story that I haven't heard before in the time we've known each other. I consider you a coach and a consultant and a friend, and I'm really grateful for all of those and more. So thank you for this time. Can't wait to see what's next.
Thanks, Robin. Always a pleasure.